Welcome to the Today Dreamer podcast. My name's Michael. I'm your host. I'm a meditation teacher, a musician, a mentor, and a conversationalist from Melbourne, Australia. And this podcast, the Today Dreamer podcast, is here to help you cultivate the practice of presence in your life in order to more fully participate or contribute to the emerging world story as it unfolds and its blossoming. Today's guest, Jimi Wollumbin, is, just a beautiful being. I came across his work on Facebook as he was helping kind of relieve some of the suffering from a recent flood in the north side of Australia. So Jimi's work has been really beautiful to kind of witness from afar. So I thought I'd get in touch and see if you'd be interested in a chat. And he said yes. I'll tell you a little bit about Jimi before we get into things. Yeah, let's just go with this bio. So Jimi is not a GP or an MD, but a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine. He's one of those rare individuals that is an expert in his field that also knows how to teach others. He's spoken at the United Nations, opened for Deepak Chopra, spoken alongside Bruce Lipton, and has even been personally insulted by the Dalai Lama. He teaches integrative doctors across America, sits on the faculty of America Integrative Health and Medicine Association, and is a lifetime member of the Tibetan Medical Institute's Friends of Tibetan Medicine. Having joined in 2002 as a regular member, he's now also an esteemed fellow of the Australian Traditional Medicine Society. So, I think that's all for an intro. Before we do get into things, as we do on every episode, I'm going to ask you to, or rather invite you to just pause for a moment from whatever's been happening in your day or in this week or, in this past month, and just kind of take one or two really gentle, deep breaths with me, with us, together, before we get into this chat with Jimi. Feel free to gently close your eyes. Or you can leave them open if you prefer. And as gracefully and as slowly as you ever have in your whole life prior to this moment, see if we can take in a nice, gentle inhalation through the nose. Whenever it is that you may reach the peak of this breath, there's an open invitation to just pause and feel into the subtleties of that experience before gracefully exhaling just as smoothly on the way out. Here's the conversation with Jimi. So there's something that has happened that was quite interesting in our coming together before we even knew that we were together in a way for this meeting.
Yes.
And
Okay.
It was this idea of the whirling dervish, actually.
Huh?
And I've heard you speak these words a few times. I didn't really know what it meant. So I had to look into it, and it kind of synchronistically happens to be something that a friend of mine had recently inquired about, because I speak about these kind of practices of presence, and it's kind of like the territory that I play in on the podcast. The podcast is here to help people feel into or cultivate their practice of presence, whatever that may look or feel like in their lives, so that hopefully there can be some deepening or some kind of participation or contribution to the emergence of the blossoming of the world story that's kind of coming into being. So this is kind of, I guess, again, another sense of a container. But the whirling dervish itself caught my attention because it was kind of, I didn't know anything about it. And it was very interesting when I started looking into it, and this golden thread kept unraveling into something quite marvelous. And I wanted to know, I guess Another theme, quite probably a deeper one that comes up now that that I've started rolling, is this sense of the body, and almost like really, really having a look at that, having a chat about that, and on a really deep level, it would be nice to explore the question around the whirling dervish and how you've used it in terms of an analogy for the body and or for health, and the idea of I guess what is the body? What actually is the body? I think that's quite an interesting question. So I'm not sure if that's got
Great.
some things
Yes.
firing.
Good. No, it does indeed. It really does, and that's really helpful. I just need to have a dance floor, and then we can whirl.
Yeah.
Then we can swirl and twirl together and see where it goes.
Yeah.
So, because I fancy myself as a poet in blooming, then the words that I got out of that were the whirling dervish in community, and then we can touch upon those. Some of the questions that, some of the sense of the community, like how does one walk one's spiritual path in community? A lot of the models that we have are monastic and monk-like and sannyasin and reclusive and ascetic, and yet those are the models that we all have, and the classical texts that we read by, and yet none of us are living that life. And so, how do we integrate that? What do we do with those things if we're not a yogi in a cave or a monk in a monastery? How does one learn from, all of that depth of wisdom that are in those traditions, and yet apply it as a barista in Melbourne with a child that has autism and a dog that has dandruff? Let's put that into the mix and then see how all of those classical texts and ideas, what they mean for us. So yeah, I think that there's an enormous amount we can discuss around soul, spirituality, embodiment, and the modern world. And does that sound like it's going to speak to your listeners and be congruent with your podcast?
I feel like it already is. And I feel like anyone, if we are kind of putting this bit out, I think everyone is kind of already quite excited about the idea of it, because I feel like I am.
Fantastic. Well, let's keep going with that then. Let's just keep rolling with that question of where is the place for soul? Here's the language that I would use, right? Where is the place for soul and spirit, although I define those things very differently, in the modern world, right? In the modern landscape. And the modern landscape, we can define it however long we want, but at least 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago, Yeats wrote, the Irish mystic poet, Golden Dawn, amazing character, wrote a poet. No, T.S. Eliot did. T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland. Sorry, not Yeats. T.S. Eliot wrote this poem called The Wasteland. And in a way, the wasteland is modernity, but it's a wasteland of soul. It's the stark grey space of the rat wheel. It's that the world in all of its myriad of colours and textures and flavours and feelings dulls for the soul, right? And so how in the let's just say post-industrial era, where there's concrete and factories and machines and efficiency and everything moves by the hands of a clock, rather than the sort of more flowing seasons of monsoon and cicada song, then how does one move through that rhythm as a cog in a wheel, right? Not as a cog in a wheel. How does one inhabit that divine watch that the divine watchmaker perhaps made, to use that the debate that goes through Christian circles, instead as a whirling dervish rather than a cog? How do we do that? That's a question, right? That's a question for you and I to try to explore. How does one find soul, not in the Himalayas 2,500 years ago, not in a monastic order of San Franciscans, of all sorts of different monks and monastery traditions or nuns, right? In the Middle Ages, right? Not as a nunkari in Central Desert Australia, but as, you know, as someone that has Wi-Fi bills, someone that has to catch public transport, someone that has all these responsibilities and lives in some form of indentured slavery, most likely, because the economic systems require us to keep moving because it's very hard to otherwise be fed and sheltered, right? How how does one not become a cog in a wheel, but how does one move like a whirling dervish inside that space? Now that's a question for us, right? I don't know if I got the answers, but I think the question is the most important thing, that we ask that, and that it highlights for us that what does it highlight? For me, what that highlights as an extra frame to this dialogue is that the wisdom traditions of which both of us are passionate and have explored, right? Various different wisdom traditions. They can't be taken literally. They are always a finger pointing to the moon. And if we instead get stuck too strongly on the wisdom tradition, like the text says, the Buddha said, you know, as soon as you're saying the Buddha said, the Buddha is laughing. The Buddha is laughing at you. As soon as you're pulling out your Buddha Bible and saying, no, 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 the sutra this, the Buddha said. The Buddha's saying, this is why I wouldn't let you make statues of me for 1,500 years. And this is why when I said, when you said, what shall we call you when you are gone? I told you, just call me thus gone. Don't call me Buddha. Don't call me John. Don't call me Tathagat. Don't call me any of those things, because I don't want you to get lost on the finger. I'm pointing at the moon. Watch where I'm pointing. Seek what I sought. Don't follow me. Seek what I sought. It's that way. And so traditions that were made in the past that are expressing something around a state of being, not an external place, not like 3 streets on the left and around the roundabout, but navigating to an internal experience, an asana or a dance of consciousness. That's what the Buddha is saying. Like this, go like this, be like a flag in the wind. That's what Christ is saying. That's what they're all saying. That's what, that's what the shamans are learning. It's like, you do this and you do that, and this is how you get to that place. This is how you get to that place. So those traditions have said all of these things about trying to get there, but they're wrapped up in all of this literal stuff, like the Bible as well, that has the external trappings of a culture that is not ours, that's gone. But they still hold diamonds. They still hold diamonds if we can learn to follow the gaze of where the finger is that's pointing to the moon, and not get stuck on that finger, right? And so I've just said a lot of things. I've said the modern world is a wasteland for soul in a whole bunch of ways, and it wants to turn us into a cog in a wheel. And I've said, how do we instead be a whirling dervish in a modern wheel, in the modern world, and in community, surrounded by people and responsibilities and pets and husbands and wives and work offices? How do we do those things? What we're talking about is inside accessing wisdom traditions from the past, and I'm so about that, whether it's Amazonian or Egyptian, it sort of doesn't matter to me. Like, wisdom is wisdom. But then how do we access those in a way that actually doesn't just leave us doing things like, well, my Amazonian Bible says that I need to have 4 condor feathers and I need to put them in the east side of my wing, and then I must have this berry, and if I do that, then I'll enter a spiritual state. You really got the finger then. That's what you got. You didn't get the moon, you got the finger, right? And that's what we're talking about. Those are the complex questions that I think I'd love to try and tease out with you. What does that bring up for you? What are your thoughts? What's your wisdom and insight when you hear all of those
well, it's a beautiful
gushing ideas?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. I kind of, what I'm kind of feeling into, I guess, is like looking at the moon with our eyes closed, and rather than kind of getting distracted by the finger with them open. So it's almost like a feeling into, or a sense, a sensing into of sorts, a feeling beyond the emotional sense, and the body comes into that beautifully. And also, when I was kind of listening to this, I'm not sure what religion it was. I think it might have been Sufism or Sufism, or it came from Rumi, and it was this guy with a beard, and it looked like a very
Cool.
wise guy with a beard. So it got
All
my
right then, I'm
attention,
sold.
and it was a video from like 12 years ago or something. So it's been around for a while, and he was talking about the whirling dervish. And if we're kind of sticking with this kind of space, it was, with what you're saying about how do we kind of, um, you know, get the essence in a different kind of, we're in a totally different kind of space right now, and this kind of this whatever we want to call it, it's this new paradigm, it's this new space that we're existing within. And how do we kind of, I've been dancing around the idea of bringing the monastery into the home, but in our own way. So it kind of fits quite nicely into what the questioning that we're kind of moving into. But when he was speaking about the whirling dervish, he was saying that as they whirl, there's almost like everything in the universe is moving, and the whirling is a movement as well, that's kind of an accentuation of that, and a representation of that. And the feet on the floor is like this grounding element, and the whirling itself creates the movement that raises you up to the moon, in a sense, maybe from that sense of feeling. And as we whirl, it's almost like the tension point between the ground and that kind of movement, or that spiral upwards, that is kind of, that's kind of the place to be. That's kind of where it's at. And it's interesting that that I'm kind of like trying to connect that with what you're saying. It feels like it does connect kind of naturally, but it's this space in the middle, and it can't, you can't really get there by staring at the finger or putting those feathers in your hat. It needs to be somehow accessed, because there is a diamond there, and it's kind of hidden in plain sight, it seems, which is interesting.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's almost like, how do we feel into that space? And yeah, there's all these phrases, let go, surrender, or
Yes. Yes.
there's all this stuff that comes up,
And they
and
can all feel like a finger at particular points, can't they? It's just like, oh, just surrender. It's like, yeah, and
yeah,
fuck you too. I've heard
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Just let go.
exactly,
Oh,
yeah,
oh, great. That was easy. Just let go. Now I've got it. Thank you. I
yeah,
should have looked at that section of my Bible, and then I'd be fine. Like,
yeah. What comes up for me is almost like a gradual kind of how this process is gradually unfolding, and it's almost like less force maybe needed to be applied or something, and maybe there's a natural moving into, and an acceptance of a recognition that that's happening already, and it's okay wherever we're at in that process. But then at
yeah,
the same time, almost like that, I don't know, there seems to be a calling forth, or a need from a collective level, but without panic. So it's a kind of like a paradoxical thing. It's like
yes,
yeah, I don't know. That's kind of what comes up. I'm going to throw it back, or kind
yes,
of gently
great.
allow the breeze to flow back
Yes,
in your direction.
yes, wonderful. So there was lots in there. One of the things that it adds to me to the discussion as well is, rather than just how does one, I want to say, court soul,
Mm,
behold the moon and court soul like a lover, not just in modernity, in the wasteland, in the machine, on the treadmill, but also in community,
mm,
as a social being, in the village, right? And so many of our stories as well uh, are of suggest to us that spirit is found outside of the world, beyond the world, above the world, outside of the village. The shaman has his or her hut outside away from the main thrust of the village life, away from the pigs and the chickens and the butcher and the candlestick maker. Like, the shaman's out. The monastery is out, and spirit is up, hovering above. We must transcend. It's like a ghost. It's ethereal. Spirit is otherworldly. It's numinous. And so there's all of these things suggesting outside of life. The thing that you're yearning for is found somewhere outside, away from the dishes, away from the children, away from the bills. Like, yes, it must be away from these things for sure, because the wasteland is such a, it's such a wasteland. It must be away. And so we're not living in a tent or a hut or a monastery outside of the village. We're living very much inside the village. And I'm living, in a family, right? And so how does the extra question that I think it's really important for us is to be asking, with all of those images in mind, of the old world, and now the fact of our current circumstances, how does one learn from those masters, like Rumi? How does one learn to whirl, right? And that all of the whirling, all the whirling that you've seen, and all that beautiful imagery and that great tradition that's gone 1,000 years now, is because Rumi was walking through the village. He was walking through the town square or the village, and there was, I think, bells that rung, or there was something happened, right, in the world, but something in the world that's here. Let's say it was bells, and the Sufis will correct me when I turns out that I got that wrong. Something happens in the world, and then he's just delighted by it, right? And he just stands there in the middle of the square, and he just starts turning, and and that's the first. He was the first whirling dervish, and it is, and that was a spontaneous expression of reverie where he was transported by the village bells, let's say, but it could have been a murmuration of swallows, and Rumi still would have twirled, right? It could have been a thunderclap, it could have been, I think, like a bitch having puppies in the corner of the street, and he still could have whirled, right? And the point is, it was in the world, and it was in the body as well. And so that's why I direct people towards soul increasingly at this point as an antidote to the disembodied and ethereal nature of spirituality, spirit, ghostiness, outside of the world, above the world, transcending the world, beyond the world, with the dichotomy that we've got of here's the material stuff and here's the spiritual stuff. And our world is dominated by material stuff, and then we want to escape it into the spiritual stuff, right? And those kinds of myths and models that are so common in the New Age, at least, very common, I don't think they're effective. I think they leave us with the finger, and they don't leave us with the moon. They don't not enough do they leave us, all of us, meaning me. They don't leave me, they didn't leave me with that as a whirling dervish in the midst of the village. They left me as a cog that then spun and spun and spun, and then just sort of like tried to get out of here and went and walked barefoot around India for a whole bunch of time, or ate out of dumpsters, and then just was like, well, then I'll just have to reject all of that. And then I got a woman pregnant, and here I am in the world now. and I can't reject all of that and follow the renunciate path anyway. And so then what does that mean? Do I just lament that I'm stuck here in the material world, and that spirituality hovers above, and I can only escape it, the material world, in peak experiences, meditative or ayahuasca induced, or sun dancing or whatever it is, that I can only access the other world of spirit in those transcendent moments when I get out and beyond all of this? Or is soul, which is classically the bridge between spirit and body, soul delights in the world. Soul is the language that we have that says it's the part of us that came to work and to try and to fight and to love and to lust and to lose and to swirl, to be swirled around, by the world, to grow sick, to grow old, to give birth, to have dandruff, to have. Soul says yes to all of it. Soul says, bring it on. I'm going on this ride. Take me down. I want to jump down, feet first or head first through that birth canal, and here we go. And you're like, yeah, I just read the contract. There will be plenty of suffering and strife and discord. It will not be comfortable. And so I was like, yeah, that's a part of the point, right? I go and do that, and afterwards I feel great. Yes. So the language for me of soul has largely replaced the language of spirituality, even though spirit is something that I think is a beautiful concept that still needs to be upheld. I tend to direct the conversation for myself and think in terms of soul more, because it is the bridge between those poles that we've separated in the West, body and spirit, right? And because it enables us to access something that is not the wasteland inside the wasteland and inside community, that's still within family, within loneliness, within mortgages. Soul says and can say, yes, this too is fodder for my fire. Yes, give me your drudgery. Yes, give me your pain. Yes, give me your tragedy and your heartache and your loneliness. Give me the challenge, the soul says. The soul says that. Now, of course, too much of any of those things can result in trauma, right? And then it's not growthful in any way. And that's rough. But rough is a trite way to say it. But still having a language that enables us to say yes to actually where we find ourselves, with Wi-Fi and smartphones and clothes all made in China and bills that we need to pay, all sorts of little, that's where we're at, man. That's the reality for the vast majority of human beings today. So how do we have that and not make that a wasteland? How do we do that? Because that's where we are. There are those things. We inhabit a place of chordom at times. And is that the thing that you do and then you must do, and then you can climb your mountain and experience something meaningful and something larger than yourself? Or is there other language where we can say, where it can bring it down here? And in this continent, on Australia, it's not a transcendent. It's not an Indian ladder up into the sky. It's not chakras lined up and elements lined up in a linear fashion that goes up, 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 and away. It's not that. It's here down. It's in the earth. That what is sacred is here. It's manifest. It's not. It's imminent, right? It's not transcending our world. That which is magical, that which is meaningful, that which we yearn for most deeply, is not hovering above the world. It's in the land. It's in your feet. It's in your bones. It's in your menstrual blood. It's in your sweat. It's in your aching muscles and your aching back. It's here. It's definitely in the land. And so that's why we incarnate. Perhaps if we just add in some extra New Age philosophy on top of that, we come into the embodied experience, an embodied experience that contains all of those things. We exist in a cosmos, not only that has the weak nuclear force and gravity and all that stuff, but we exist in a cosmos that has hemorrhoids. It does. Perhaps there's other universes in the multiverse where hemorrhoids don't exist, but the universe that we exist in has hemorrhoids. And so how do we inhabit this universe with its hemorrhoids? Where we can experience all of those things, right? All of those snotty, hard, glitchy, awkward, scratchy, gurgly, embodied, sunburnt, bloody, fiery. That's the domain that we find ourselves in. And can we, on our journey here, take that and say, and find a way to alchemically transmute that, the wasteland, to take the wasteland of the world, right? The outside of the world. The wasteland is the finger, you know, it's not the moon, it's the outside, it's the signpost. Rather than Rome, going to Rome and getting all of the architecture, it's the signpost, you know, like in 1,500 kilometers to the left that says Rome. And that's where you're sitting on, right? It's like, how do we take the external, the wasteland of the world, and how do we transmute it so that it is an oasis, so that it nourishes the part of us that yearns for connection, that yearns to be a part of something larger, that yearns to behold the moon and be transported by that? How do we do that in the world, in community, in modernity, in a marriage, in a mortgage? Just keep listing them off, right? In a wheelchair, like, you know, like in a traumatized nervous system, you know, in a life that didn't have parents that were kind. You know, those are the, I think if we're going to talk about soul or spirituality, then, which we are, then for me, I find so much danger in the way in which it's normally spoken of, that there is a great harm that is done by selling people a beautiful story that ends up giving them the finger, right? That ends up leaving them on the outside if we're not careful. And so that's my deepest concern about anyone coming into traditional medicine, of like, yeah, you can just end up on the outside of this tradition after 20 years. You're just inside it, and it's just another religion, it's another ideology, it's another ism. No, the Yellow Emperor says, you know, and you don't even, you didn't follow what the Yellow Emperor was seeking, you just follow what the Yellow Emperor says. It's a trap. Don't do that. That's not it. That's not it. Be very careful about deep, long, beautiful traditions, of which I am an advocate in medicine. And I would say the same in terms of one's soul. Not to push them away, because then you've just got the wasteland, right? But how do we entertain these two things? And the normal way in which people speak about it, I find, seems to give us this dichotomy of there's the world and the drudgery, and then there's the spirit up here, and then we do that when we're meditating, and otherwise this stuff is not spiritual, which includes all of my funny emotions as well, like my possessiveness and my jealousy and my rage and my masturbatory fantasies, all this stuff that just exists, but sort of like, there's no space for it. Whereas soul says, yes to the anger and the outrage, yes to the masturbatory fantasies, yes to all of it. And so that's what I find more inclusive and more rich. That's what leads me more frequently. I'm not trying to say I inhabit some higher state of consciousness than you or anyone else that's listening to us. I don't. But it leads me more frequently to a state where I feel like I'm able to behold the moon, or that I am that whirling dervish amidst the fluster and flow of life, or just that I'm not in the wasteland. You know, I often am in the wasteland, but those are the ways in which I think about it or speak about it that helps me to minimize the territory of the wasteland inside my mind and my life and my heart, in terms of what's the wasteland? What am I saying no to? What's the non-spiritual? You know, so we can't just concentrate all of our fairy dust over here in the Buddha realms, in heaven, in the shamanic seventh realm of, you know, like whatever, in the chakras. All the stuff that's glittering and beautiful and meaningful and magical is over there in this category. And then most of the world is a wasteland. Then it's just not a chakra. You know, it's a dishwasher. It's a bloody dishwasher, you know. It's like ho-hum at best, right? How can we frame this as citizens of the modern world, as people that are outside of tradition, rediscovering new traditions, yearning for something, yearning for connection, yearning for what? Yearning for what are we yearning for? What's our language? Is it spirit or is it soul? Makes a big difference. Yearning for something. these are the ways in which I speak about it and think about it and approach it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections on that.
Toast comes up for me for some reason.
Great. Awesome. Toast. Is there anything more sublime and soulful than fresh, hot, for me, buttered toast? Exactly. What a great example.
But it comes up in a strange way because I guess if you leave the toast under the grill for too long, it gets burnt. And then it takes a little bit of space from that environment to kind of, take it out and in a very sacred and ordinary way, slowly start to kind of, you know, with a butter knife, get rid of some of that ash. And I think what you were sharing there, in terms of even your own journey from one extreme of the spectrum to the other, and then finding a way somewhere in the middle, um, to dance. I think that was quite a beautiful, representation of a deepening of soul through that experience. So I feel like
Mm.
even if that does happen and those traps are fell into, which has happened to me as well in
Yes.
quite a similar way,
Yes.
I think there's still like a deepening of that ensoulment process, which will, allow those footsteps to, I don't know, feel more embodied. And there is something about, connecting to the sacred within the ordinary that is quite a beautiful thing to touch, and to touch more and more regularly, or gradually, at least have an ambition to do that. I think that itself creates a space for other people as well. And this idea of, practically walking rather than kind of dictating, um, is something that I've been kind of looking into recently. And this idea of really just helping, or participating and contributing by the footsteps themselves. Um, but yeah, I can definitely kind of feel into what you're saying around, you know, the care that's deserved in that space. And yeah, also this idea of the space itself, and having having a moment to breathe amongst the community, and finding where your kind of balance of, this is my space for I'm using mine in this kind of regular way, but this is the time that I can kind of sit here and, um, breathe into a bit of space, so that when I do re-enter the community, in this kind of dancing motion, as the twirl goes on, I'm able to, find that middle space between kind of the heavens and the earth, like in the middle of that spin.
Mm.
It's like this.
Mm.
I guess it's kind of a balance point, but it's always shifting and always moving, so it's never a kind
Yes.
of a solid
Yes.
thing. And there's a sense
Yes.
of it
Exactly.
being this real kind of, yeah, there is this kind of, what's the word, it feels like there's a, harmony, or
Yes.
harmonious, joining of vibrations that kind of meet in a space where it just kind of, there's a singing that takes place, and or it feels like maybe you're on some kind of a track or something, and the rhythm can be right,
Yes.
and it can only be really felt into. You can't really measure it or quantify it. And when you're on that
Yes.
kind of a path or track, you kind of know it. And when you're not, you know it as well, because there's signals
Yes.
that can be quite difficult and overwhelming, especially, um, depending on where you are and how far you are off that track. Um, but they are just kind of signals. And I think there's this kind of, yeah, just feeling into when the toast is ready, and not, and if it is burnt, that's okay as well. We just need to be mindful about taking it out and scraping off the ash. It's not gone or destroyed. But that's kind of what comes up for me with the sharing, and also this thing that you've said in the past around dis-ease. And this is almost like a, personally, a quite a confusing part of my explorations at the moment, is this idea of managing the environment. It's like the idea of it
Yes.
itself, and like there is a part of that requires a sort of intentional management, but then that kind of dances along with the idea of just, smiling at the difficulties as well. And like you said about them realizing that that's part of the ensoulment process. So there's something to do with, how do I, amongst this kind of, plague, and amongst this kind of collapse, and amongst this kind of, you know, um, this intense sense of chaos energy, you know, how do I find the space within that, and how do I maybe manage my environment, both you know, from in terms of my body and the kind of microcosms and like the, you know, and also, um, you know, the space in which that I live and the kind of seemingly outer realms, which are obviously all connected. But how do I kind of manage that and the people that I interact with and you know, being quite conscious and intentional about who and how I have those interactions with. And yeah, it's quite a complex thing, but I think the main thing seems to be the space, and also it seems like both. Like it seems like there's an allowing and a touching the sacred within the ordinary, and a kind of recognition of that in the moment through the breath for some reason, and then there seems to be a what's coming up for me is also gradually moving in a better kind of in towards a better managed environment, or creating that space by either taking time away so that there can be that kind of balance, or by kind of rearranging things but in a gentle kind of natural way. I don't know, that's, I just want to
Yes.
know what you feel
Okay.
around that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. There was a lot in there. The theme that came out for me repeatedly that I'd like to respond to is this: the ambiguity of the term space, right?
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, we use space as in time and space. It's matter. It's here, and we've 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 made space a tangible thing. You know, this is my space. Welcome into my space. Here. You know, oh, you're two in my space. You know, you're two in my face. On the other hand, though, we say in the new age now, people will say, "Oh, I was just holding space for them," and in that moment, we're saying something very different. It's like holding space. What do you mean? Were you like what was going on there? It's like we know what you mean, but we're using it in a very different way, right? We're saying I was bringing deep presence to that moment, right? I was holding space for them. I was bringing deep presence. And it's very different to a map. Where in space are my glasses right now? Are they by the phone? No, you know, like, so we've got these two different things. And again, our culture has materialized space at a bottom level, right? From a scientific perspective. And I think that part of the wasteland is the schism that has been made that gives us this bifocal lens that splits the world in half, that creates, you know, an up and a down to everything, a right and a wrong, a body and a spirit, you know, like a left and a right, a good and an evil, you know, an us and a them. It's a victim and a perpetrator. Everything, we've got these goggles on, and everything fits into one of those, you know, desirable or undesirable, good and bad, you know. And that lens, which has split space off and put it in this particular way, is partly what creates the wasteland. Is that we exist in an external space as something outside of me, space as in the place, the literal space of where my glasses are when I can't find them. However, the experience that you're speaking about, the experience of the whirling dervish, it's not like you must do it in Persia. That's the space you go and whirl. Which was the town that Rumi did the spinning, and where was it? You know, like I must go there. No,
Let's ring those
obviously
bells.
you
Yeah.
must not. That's right. Or how many rotations did he do per minute, and exactly where was his hand in the thing? And then you turn his head. It's like also wrong. Like you can see how that could be either a beautiful spiritual practice, or it could be a dogmatic cult, where they're just like, and on that day he had the sandals on that had red paint on the left strap, so we must always wear the red. And if one does not, then one should have one's beard shaven and chased naked through the town and shamed with goose feathers, and let it be known for all time. You know, like there's something there's an autistic literalism to the way in which our dogma and our dogmatic mind wants to grab a hold of things, right? And so that's what we do with traditions. We biblify. It says in the Bible, it says the thing. And so the space that we're talking about, we say, then we do that because space is different to spirit. There's space that we can explore in a rocket ship, and there's spirit, which is something that hovers above that. You can't take a rocket ship to spirit because this rocket ship can only take you through space, right? So we've got this weird ambiguity and sense around the world and where and what it is, because we've thingified the world.
Thank you for your participation in this episode of the Today Dreamer podcast. I'll leave links on our beautiful guest in the show notes section on the website, where you can check out all their wonderful work and offerings. And if you're interested in working one-on-one with me, feel free to head over to todaydreamer.com and get in touch. Also, if you'd like to participate in some group meditation sessions online that I'm offering for free only to listeners of the show, then please send me an email through the contact form on the website. I'll add you to the list, and I'll give you all the details to that and any other upcoming kind of offerings around helping your development in this space. Thank you so much again